Crime never sleeps, and neither do we. Welcome back to another gripping case, where we dive into the shadows of the most chilling crimes and uncover the truth piece by piece. Tonight, we take you deep into Batangas, where a young woman's night out turned into a nightmare. This is a story of horror, of justice, and of the relentless pursuit to find the monster responsible. Stay with me as we unravel the case of Angela Martinez. Tonight, we're going to Batangas, a quiet province in the Philippines known for its beaches, heritage sites, and close-knit communities. But in 2019, something happened there that shattered that sense of peace. A young woman vanished, and when she was found, well, let's just say, it wasn't the homecoming her family had been hoping for. Angela Martinez was 22 years old. She wasn't reckless. She wasn't the kind of girl who vanished without a word. She had routines, habits, small things her family could count on. That's why when she didn't come home after a quick trip to the market, her family knew something was wrong. Her father, Miguel, didn't waste a second. Grabbing his keys, he stormed out the door, his pulse pounding in his ears. The streets were quiet, the dim glow of streetlights stretching shadows across the pavement. He drove his old motorbike slowly, scanning every alley, every corner. Maybe she had stopped by a friend's house? Maybe she had lost track of time? But in his gut, he already knew the truth. Back at home, her mother, Rosa, clutched her phone, dialing over and over. One ring, two rings, straight to voicemail, again, and again, and again. Each time, the robotic voice on the other end, "The number you are calling is currently unavailable," felt like a knife twisting deeper into her chest. The walls of their small home seemed to close in. Rosa's hands trembled as she scrolled through her messages. Her last text to Angela, "Be home soon," had been left unread hours ago. Her fingers hovered over the keypad, desperate to type another message, but she knew it wouldn't make a difference. Angela was out there somewhere in the dark, and she wasn't answering. The search begins. Neighbors were questioned, but most shook their heads. "No, we didn't see anything. No, we didn't hear anything. No, she didn't stop by here." But then, the whispers started. One neighbor, an old man who rarely spoke, cleared his throat and hesitated before murmuring, "I heard something, a scream, quick, cut off, maybe around 8. Another neighbor, an anxious-looking woman clutching her robe tightly around her, added, "I thought I heard running, like struggling footsteps, but I didn't look." She looked away, ashamed, because that's the thing about fear. When it's not happening to you, it's easy to ignore. Miguel felt his stomach drop. His hands balled into fists. He had walked these same streets just an hour ago. Had Angela been here? Had she been screaming for help? Had someone heard and done nothing? By the time the police were called, it was already too late. The gruesome discovery. It was still dark when a local farmer stepped out into his fields before dawn. Just another morning. Just another routine. He pulled his tattered jacket tighter against the early morning chill and inhaled the scent of damp earth. The sugarcane swayed gently in the breeze, whispering against itself in the dim light. Then he saw it. An odd shape in the distance, hunched low among the stalks. At first, he thought it was a bundle of discarded trash. Maybe an old mattress or a pile of clothes someone had dumped overnight. But as he stepped closer, his stomach twisted. His breath hitched in his throat. Something was wrong. The shape wasn't garbage. It was a girl. Angela Martinez lay on her back, her body twisted unnaturally, like she had been thrown there and abandoned. Her clothes were torn, one strap of her blouse hanging loose over her shoulder, her jeans streaked with dirt. One sandal was missing, the other lay several feet away, half buried in the earth. Her hair, long, dark, tangled, spread around her head like ink spilling into the soil. Her arms lay stiff at her sides, her hands frozen in half-clenched fists, dirt caked beneath her fingernails. As if she had fought, as if she had clawed at the ground, at someone, at anything. And then, there was the blood. Not a lot. Not enough for her to have bled out. But enough. Enough to know something terrible had happened here. The farmer stumbled back, his breath coming in sharp, panicked bursts. His fingers fumbled as he pulled his phone from his pocket. He had to call someone. The police. Anyone. But his hands wouldn't stop shaking. His heart thundered in his chest as he pressed the numbers. The dispatcher answered. "Hello, what's your emergency?" He swallowed, his voice barely more than a whisper. I found a body." Minutes later, red and blue lights slashed through the darkness, flooding the sugarcane field with unnatural brightness. Police officers moved carefully, stepping around evidence markers, their boots crunching against the dry earth. The air felt thick, heavy, like the field itself was holding its breath. The forensic team worked swiftly, snapping photos, measuring distances, collecting every tiny piece of evidence. Every officer there had seen their share of crime scenes. But nothing. Not the blood, not the bruises, not even the lifeless body before them, was as chilling as the silence. Angela had fought. That much was clear. The scratches down her arms, deep, red grooves, spoke of desperation. The bruises darkening her wrists, her shoulders, evidence that someone had held her down. But something else stood out. Her necklace was missing. It wasn't expensive, just a small silver pendant. But she never took it off. Her family swore by it. Maybe it had been lost in the struggle. Maybe it had been ripped away by accident. Or maybe it meant everything. Because killers don't just take lives. Sometimes they take trophies. And somewhere out there, a monster was walking free, Angela's necklace possibly dangling from his fingers. A silent, chilling reminder of what he had done. This case, it was just beginning. A crime scene is like a puzzle, one where the pieces aren't neatly placed inside a box, but scattered in the dirt, smeared in blood, and hidden beneath the weight of silence. Blood stains, torn fabric, footprints. Everything tells a story, and this one was screaming for justice. What was once just another quiet stretch of farmland had transformed overnight. The sugarcane field was no longer just a field. It was a place where fear had lived, where someone had fought for their life and lost. Angela Martinez, 22 years old. Her name wasn't just a name anymore. It was a headline, a whispered conversation behind closed doors, a wound in the community that no one knew how to heal. And on that cold morning, beneath the harsh glare of police floodlights, investigators began piecing together the final moments of a life that should have never ended this way. The first clues. There's something unnervingly eerie about crime scenes in the countryside. No sirens bouncing off buildings, no flickering streetlights above. Just the quiet hum of insects, the distant croak of a frog, the wind stirring the cane stalks. But here, in this one spot, the silence felt different. Heavy, suffocating. Angela's body lay in a clearing where the stalks had been forced apart, flattened by something or someone. The trampled grass told a story of a struggle, a violent, desperate one. Her clothes were torn. The dirt beneath her was disturbed. Deep grooves cut through the soil where she had crawled, tried to get away. Her fingernails were jagged, some broken clean off, and beneath them traces of skin. She had fought back, hard. And yet, as the lead investigator scanned the scene, his jaw tightened. There were signs here that only trained eyes could recognize. Bruising around the wrists, dark, circular marks, telling of something that had held her down. A belt? A rope? Whatever it was, it had cut into her skin. Blood pooled near her mouth. Small, but enough to indicate she had coughed it up. Her left shoe missing. Flung several feet away, its placement suggesting it had been kicked off in the struggle. And then, the most chilling detail. Her necklace. Gone. Angela's family had been adamant. She never took it off. A simple silver pendant, not expensive but sentimental. If it had fallen off, it should have been here, tangled in her hair, buried in the dirt, something. But it wasn't. Someone had taken it. Was it yanked from her neck in the struggle? Or worse, had it been taken after? A trophy? A keepsake? A secret prize carried away by the hands of a killer? And then, something else, something even worse. Angela hadn't been killed here. The drag marks in the dirt, the way her body was positioned. She had been moved. The crime hadn't ended in this sugarcane field. It had ended somewhere else. And someone had brought her here, dumped her, and walked away, leaving nothing behind but death. The autopsy speaks. While detectives processed the scene, the medical examiner began their work. And the truth they uncovered was worse than the officers had feared. Angela had suffered. Deep bruising lined her ribs and arms. Marks of forceful restraint. Raw abrasions on her wrists. The kind left by something digging into her skin. Something tight. Something meant to hold her in place. And then, the worst of it. Sexual assault. The words landed like a hammer. A weight so heavy the air in the room seemed to still. Seasoned detectives, men and women who had seen the darkest parts of humanity, clenched their fists, averted their eyes, because it never got easier. She had been overpowered. Her attacker had controlled every moment, decided when it would end. And when it was over, he had strangled her. Not quickly. The bruising suggested it hadn't been instant. She had struggled, fought for air, and then her heart had stopped. The killer had won, and Angela had been left behind, discarded like she was nothing. But she wasn't nothing. She was a daughter, a friend, a life that mattered. And now, she was the center of an investigation that would shake this town to its core. The killer's mistake. No crime is perfect. Every attacker, no matter how careful, leaves something behind. And Angela? She had made sure her killer wouldn't walk away unscathed. Her defensive wounds told the story. Deep scratches, claw marks, desperate enough to dig into flesh. And under her nails? Skin. Not hers. His DNA. A silent witness. The kind of evidence that doesn't lie. As forensic teams bagged samples, as they lifted the tiny, undeniable proof from beneath her nails, there was a shift. Because now they weren't chasing a ghost. Now they had something real. They had the killer's DNA. And they were going to find him. In cases like this, we start close to home. We interrogate those who knew her best. Because sometimes, the killer hides in plain sight. It's one of the oldest, most unshakable rules in homicide investigations. When a woman is murdered, you look at the men in her life first. Statistics don't lie. More often than not, the perpetrator is someone she trusted. And Angela Martinez? She had a boyfriend. His name was Miguel Soriano, 24 years old, a construction worker, a quiet, hardworking guy with no criminal record, no history of violence. He and Angela had been in a relationship for nearly a year, and by all accounts, their relationship was solid. No reports of domestic violence, no explosive public fights, no known affairs, but none of that mattered. Not yet, because Miguel Soriano was the last person to text Angela before she disappeared. And that made him suspect number one. The boyfriend under the spotlight. The interrogation room was designed for one thing, to break people down. The walls were bare, painted an unremarkable shade of gray. A single metal table sat in the center, its surface scratched and dull from years of nervous hands tapping, gripping, sweating against it. And in one of the two plastic chairs, Miguel sat. His hands were clasped together, knuckles pale. His knee bounced restlessly beneath the table, a steady rhythm that betrayed his anxiety. His eyes were rimmed red, his face hollowed by exhaustion. He looked like a man grieving, but grief can be faked. So can shock. And that's exactly what the detectives were there to determine. Was Miguel heartbroken? Or was he hiding something? The detective across from him, Detective Rivas, leaned forward slightly, voice calm but firm. Tell us about the last time you spoke to Angela. Miguel exhaled sharply, rubbing a trembling hand over his face. I texted her around 6:30, he said. She was at the market. I was just checking in, you know? Did she respond? Miguel swallowed hard, eyes flicking downward. Something about the memory seemed to hurt. Yeah. She said she was heading home soon. That was the last message. After that, nothing. Silence. Like she had been swallowed by the night. Miguel lifted his head, meeting the detective's gaze with desperate, pleading eyes. You don't think I... He stopped himself, exhaling sharply. I loved her. Detective Rivas didn't react. Because love doesn't mean innocence. Miguel knew that. And so the detectives pressed on. Where were you last night, Miguel? At work. I had the night shift at the construction site on the east side. What time did you get there? 7. And you didn't leave? No, Miguel said quickly. Too quickly. He caught himself running a hand through his hair. I mean, no. I was there all night. The detectives exchanged a glance. Alibis were easy to claim, but they were even easier to shatter. The verification process started immediately. Detectives contacted Miguel's supervisor, a grizzled man who had worked construction for over 20 years. His response was short, to the point. Yeah, Miguel was there. Clocked in at 7, clocked out in the morning. Didn't leave. But words weren't enough. They needed proof. Surveillance footage from the construction site was pulled. And there he was, Miguel Soriano, captured on grainy black and white security footage, time-stamped and undeniable. At 7:03 p.m., he walked through the entrance gates. At 9:45 p.m., he was caught on camera operating heavy machinery. At 11:30 p.m., he was seen chatting with co-workers in the break area. There was never a moment where he left the site. And the crime scene? It was miles away. Miguel Soriano couldn't have killed Angela Martinez. The evidence was airtight. He was not the killer. When detectives officially ruled Miguel out as a suspect, his body seemed to deflate. Relief? Maybe. But then came the moment no one in that room could have anticipated. When they told Miguel Angela was gone, something inside him broke. He didn't just cry. He collapsed. His body folded in on itself, his shoulders shaking violently. His hands clenched into his hair as a raw, guttural sob tore from his throat. The kind of sound that made even the hardened officers outside the room pause. Because this wasn't staged. This wasn't guilt. This was devastation. The kind of grief that isn't neat or quiet. The kind that rips through you like a knife. One of the detectives shifted uncomfortably, clearing his throat. But Miguel wasn't looking at them anymore. He was staring at the wall, his voice cracking as he whispered, "She didn't deserve this. No, she didn't." And that led to the next, most terrifying question. If it wasn't you? Detective Rivas's voice was low, measured. Then who? Because Angela had been taken. She had been attacked. Murdered. Someone had been waiting for her in the dark. Someone had grabbed her, dragged her into that sugarcane field, held her down while she screamed. And if it wasn't Miguel Soriano, then the real killer was still out there, still free, still watching. And that meant one thing. This nightmare, it was just starting to unfold. A case can turn on the smallest clue. A stray footprint, passing remark, a flicker of movement in the corner of someone's eye. Sometimes that's all you need to crack it open. With Miguel Soriano ruled out, investigators were left staring at an unsettling truth. Angela's killer wasn't someone she knew. This wasn't a crime of passion. It wasn't a jealous boyfriend, a scorned lover, or a personal grudge. No, Angela had been chosen, and that meant the man who had dragged her into that sugarcane field, the man who had left her broken and lifeless in the dirt, was still out there, walking free, blending in, invisible. And just as the investigation threatened to stall, when leads began drying up and detectives feared the trail was growing cold, a witness came forward, and what she had seen changed everything. She was a street vendor, a woman in her late 50s who had been selling roasted peanuts near the market that evening. She had been working that spot for years, watching the rhythm of the city pass her by, unnoticed. She didn't know Angela personally, but she remembered seeing her. A young woman, pretty, dressed casually in jeans and a light blouse, carrying a small bag of groceries. She had moved quickly, purposefully, the way women do when they don't want to linger alone at night. But it wasn't Angela that caught her attention. It was the man following her. He had been careful, too careful, keeping his distance, moving just beyond the reach of the streetlights, never getting too close, never looking directly at her, but never losing sight of her either. And in that quiet, unspoken way that women recognize danger, the vendor had felt it. The wrongness, the way he hovered just long enough to unsettle. She tried to shake it off. Maybe she was being paranoid. Maybe he was just another shopper. Maybe he was waiting for someone. But then, the red cap, it stood out against the night, a sharp, unnatural pop of color in the sea of muted tones. Something about it didn't fit, didn't belong. It was an odd contrast to the way he melted into the darkness, his body language whispering predator even as he stayed just out of sight. The vendor's stomach had tightened. She wanted to tell Angela to look over her shoulder, to see what she couldn't see, but she didn't, because that's the cruel trick of hindsight. It only speaks when it's too late. The next morning, the news spread. A young woman found dead in the sugarcane fields. And the vendor knew. The man in the red cap hadn't been passing through. He had been hunting. The moment the vendor gave her statement, the investigation reignited. A physical description, a distinct piece of clothing, a direction. It wasn't a name, not yet, but it was a start. We finally had a face to look for. But criminals, they don't just sit and wait to be caught. A hooded figure, a red cap, a shadow trailing behind Angela on the night she vanished. First, it wasn't much. A vague description, a fleeting glimpse. But sometimes that's all it takes. Because when investigators started digging, pressing the right people, asking the right questions, the whispers around town led them to a name. Rodel Castillo, 25 years old, unemployed, a known troublemaker. The kind of guy people avoided, not out of fear necessarily, but because being around him meant bad things happened. And when detectives knocked on his door, he was already sweating before they even asked a single question. The troublemaker with a past. Rodel Castillo wasn't a stranger to police attention. His name had come up before. Petty theft, public disturbances, drunken fights that ended with someone in the hospital, and Rodel walking away, grinning like it was all a joke. But then there was something worse. A woman. An attempted assault case from 2 years prior. The details were murky, lost in the mess of missing paperwork and a half-hearted investigation. The victim had initially spoken out. She had given her statement, named Rodel as her attacker. Then suddenly she dropped the charges. She refused to talk further. She stopped returning calls. And just like that, case closed. Rodel walked away, untouched. But now, that history wasn't just suspicious. It was damning, because here he was again, connected to another woman, another victim. But this time, there were no second chances. Angela Martinez was dead. The interrogation room was silent except for the rhythmic ticking of the wall clock. Each second stretched too long, too heavy. Across the table, Rodel sat stiffly, arms folded tight across his chest. A thin sheen of sweat lined his forehead. His leg bounced rapidly under the table. He sniffed, cleared his throat, shifted in his seat. But he didn't ask why he was there, because he already knew. Detective Rivas leaned in, voice steady. "You were seen near the market that night." Rodel snorted. "Lots of people go to the market. A witness saw you following Angela." His eyes flicked up, just for a second, then back down. "I don't know what you're talking about. A tricycle driver picked you up near the crime scene." Silence. Something flickered across Rodel's face. Too fast to catch, but it was there. Then he shrugged, scoffed, smirked. Coincidence. Here's the thing about criminals. The dumb ones? They talk too much. The smart ones? They try to say nothing at all. But Rodel? He wasn't saying the right things. His story shifted under pressure, unraveling thread by thread. First, he was home all night. Then, actually, he was at a friend's house. But he couldn't name the friend. He swore he hadn't seen Angela. But then, maybe he had? Just in passing. He wasn't wearing a red cap. Actually, yeah, he does own one. The detectives let him talk. Because the more he talked, the deeper he buried himself. The nervous energy, the dry swallowing, the way his eyes darted to the door, like he was already calculating how fast he could get out of there. He was lying, and the detectives knew it. Nothing about Rodel added up. No solid alibi. No consistency in his story. A history of violence against women. A witness placing him in the exact spot on the exact night Angela was killed. The evidence was stacking against him. But knowing he was guilty, that wasn't enough. They needed proof. Something undeniable. Because without it, Rodel Castillo was going to slip through their fingers, just like he had before. And this time, no one was going to let that happen. The truth hides in the details. And in modern policing, DNA is the ultimate truth teller. Rodel Castillo thought he was smart. He thought he could lie his way out of this just like he had before. But science doesn't lie. And detectives? They knew they needed more than suspicion. More than a gut feeling. More than an uneasy glance in an interrogation room. They needed something irrefutable. They needed proof. And that's exactly what they were about to find. The pressure was mounting. Rodel's shifting alibi, his connection to the crime scene, the witness who had seen him following Angela. It was all piling up, but it wasn't enough to convict. Not yet. So, investigators pushed for a search warrant. It was granted, and at dawn, officers arrived at Rodel's small, run-down house on the outskirts of town. The place was a forgotten structure, rotting at the edges, peeling paint, a rusted metal gate barely hanging on by its hinges. A stray dog sniffed at the overgrown grass, pausing only to watch the officers approach. The windows were covered in grime, yellowed curtains hanging limp behind the glass. A place that looked like it had been left behind by time. But inside they found exactly what they were looking for. The house was a wreck. A cluttered maze of dirty laundry, empty beer bottles, and half-eaten food containers. The air inside was stale, thick with the scent of sweat, cigarettes, and something sour. Officers moved through the small rooms, stepping over discarded cigarette butts and piles of unwashed clothes. Then a dresser. One of the detectives pulled open a drawer, shoving aside old t-shirts, balled-up socks, and forgotten receipts. And there it was, a red cap, crumpled, worn, but unmistakable. The same one the witness had described. The same one Angela's stalker had worn. The room fell silent. A second detective opened another drawer. And sitting beneath a pile of tangled cords and loose change was something that made their breath catch. A delicate silver necklace. Thin, dainty, with a small, heart-shaped pendant. Angela's necklace. The one her family swore she never took off. The one that should have been found on her body. But instead, it had been kept, hidden, possessed. One of the detectives exhaled sharply, his fingers tightening around the evidence bag. This wasn't just a robbery gone wrong. This was personal. This was control. Rodell hadn't just taken her life. He had kept something to remember it by. And that wasn't all they found. Back at the forensic lab, the team worked quickly. Angela had fought hard. And in those last, desperate moments, she had done something that would seal her killer's fate. She had left behind evidence. Scratches lined Rodell's arms. Faint, healing, but there. Tiny remnants of skin, wedged deep beneath Angela's fingernails. DNA. Forensic specialists ran the tests, each step methodical, precise. And then, perfect match. The kind of match that doesn't leave room for doubt. The kind that closes a case. The kind that sends a murderer to prison. There are moments in an investigation where everything shifts, where the weight of the truth becomes too heavy to deny. For Rodell Castillo, that moment came at 6:42 p.m., when officers walked through his door, cuffs in hand. He was on his couch, beer in one hand, cigarette in the other. The TV blared in the background, an old boxing match flickering across the screen. The moment he saw them, his entire body went still. No smart remarks, no bravado, just silence. An officer stepped forward. Rodell Castillo, you're under arrest for the murder of Angela Martinez. He didn't fight, didn't even ask why they were there, because he already knew. They pulled him to his feet, snapped cold steel cuffs around his wrists. And that's when the mask cracked. His fingers twitched. His jaw tightened. His chest rose and fell faster than before. His face, blank. But his eyes, that's where the truth was. Because buried beneath that hardened stare, beneath all the arrogance, all the lies, there it was, fear. Because for the first time, Rodell Castillo realized, this time he wasn't getting away. This time, the evidence spoke louder than his lies. And this time, justice was coming. Every criminal has a moment of weakness. You just have to wait for it. For 12 hours, Rodell Castillo sat in the interrogation room. At first, he played the game. Arms crossed, shoulders leaning back, a lazy smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. Like he had all the time in the world. Like he thought he could outlast them. But time does strange things in a room like that. No windows, no clocks, just the low hum of fluorescent lights, the distant murmur of conversations beyond the walls, and the never-ending weight of silence. And the questions that never stopped coming, over and over, again and again. And eventually everyone cracks. The first few hours were nothing but denials. I didn't do it. I don't know that girl. I wasn't even near the market that night. The detectives didn't argue. They didn't need to, because the truth was already sitting in the room. The DNA, the red cap, the necklace, the weight of the evidence pressed down like an unbearable presence, filling every inch of the small, suffocating room. So the detectives let it sit there. Let the silence stretch. Let Rodel drown in it. By the 8th hour, his posture shifted. His shoulders slumped. His hands fidgeted. By the 10th, sweat was beading along his hairline. His foot tapped relentlessly beneath the table. By the 12th, he cracked. A deep inhale. A shaky exhale. His fingers gripped the edge of the table so tight his knuckles turned white. And then, finally, the words they'd been waiting for. Fine. His voice was hoarse. I'll tell you what happened. According to Rodel, it wasn't planned. Not exactly. That night he had been drinking. More than usual. Cheap liquor burning in his veins. His head buzzing with something dangerous. A few hits of shabu. His mind was a blur. That's what he wanted them to believe. That it was just one bad decision. One reckless moment. But then, he saw her, Angela, walking alone from the market. Her long hair swaying behind her. Her bag of groceries swinging at her side. She didn't see him. Not at first. But he saw her. And in that moment, something in him decided. I don't know why, he muttered. I just followed her. At first, he stayed in the shadows, watching. Then, as she turned into a quieter street, he grabbed her. Angela screamed, fought, scratched. She wouldn't stop fighting, he muttered. She wouldn't stop screaming. She tried to run, but he was faster. I just wanted her to stop. His voice was flat now, emotionless. I didn't mean to. But that was a lie, because the autopsy told the real story. He hadn't strangled her in a panicked frenzy. Not by accident. It had taken time, pressure, deliberation. Angela had died knowing exactly what was happening to her. And after, he left her there, took her necklace, a twisted souvenir, and walked away like nothing had happened. The confession should have been enough. But something about it didn't sit right. Rodel had been reckless, sloppy. His DNA was under Angela's fingernails. His red cap was practically gift-wrapped for the police to find. So why? Why had he been so confident no one would turn him in? Why did he sit in that interrogation room for 12 hours believing he could still walk away? And then a thought colder than anything Rodel had just confessed. Had he done this before? Or worse, had he gotten away with it before? Because Angela wasn't just a victim. She might have been the one who finally got him caught. But she might not have been his first. And that thought, that was more terrifying than anything Rodel Castillo had just confessed. Angela Martinez was dead, and her killer had admitted to everything. The case should have been over, but something still didn't add up. Because Rodel had been careless, sloppy. He had left DNA, left a trail so obvious it was almost like he expected to get away with it. And that meant one thing. He wasn't alone. The breakthrough came from an informant, someone who knew Rodel, who had run in the same circles, heard the same whispers, someone who listened, and what they heard. Rodel hadn't been alone that night. There was another name, Edgar Castillo, his cousin, not as an attacker, not as the one who grabbed Angela, held her down, stole her last breath, but as a lookout, a second set of eyes, standing in the shadows, watching, waiting, making sure no one saw what was happening. And when it was over, when Angela's body lay still in the dirt, her necklace ripped from her throat as a twisted trophy, Edgar was the one who helped Rodel escape. The informant's tip sent investigators back to the footage. Every grainy second of security video collected from the night Angela was murdered. First, nothing new. But then, there he was, Edgar Castillo, not at the crime scene itself, but close, too close, a shadow moving through the small town's quiet streets, caught on a security camera, just 2 blocks from where Angela was last seen. The timestamp? Minutes before she was attacked. He was walking quickly, looking over his shoulder, nervous, like he was waiting, like he knew exactly what was about to happen. The detectives paused the video, stared at the screen. This wasn't some random bystander. This wasn't coincidence. This was complicity. Edgar Castillo was brought in the next morning. Unlike Rodel, he didn't fight, didn't protest, didn't curse and thrash and swear it was all a mistake. He just sat there, silent, still, staring at the table like the answers were hidden in the scratches of the wood. When the detectives finally spoke, he didn't look up. "Where were you that night?" His voice was flat, emotionless. "I didn't touch her. Not I wasn't there. Not I didn't know what happened. Just, I didn't touch her." A careful choice of words. A defense built on the slimmest technicality. But under pressure, under the weight of the evidence stacking against him, the cracks started to show. "Yeah, I was there. Yeah, I saw her. Yeah, I helped him get away. But the assault? The murder? That wasn't me." He swore he had nothing to do with it. That he had no idea Rodel would take it that far. "I thought he was just messing around. Just scaring her." But was that the truth? Or was Edgar just another predator, standing in the dark, watching? And the biggest question of all, was there anyone else still out there? Justice isn't just for the victim. It's for the family, the friends, the whole community that lost a piece of their peace. Angela Martinez was gone. Her family would never hear her laughter echo through their home again. Her friends would never get another late-night message, another casual coffee invite. The world had moved forward as it always does. But for Angela's family, time had stopped the moment she took her last breath. Yet, there was still one thing left. Justice. And the people of Batangas? They weren't just watching. They were demanding it. By the time the trial started, Angela's case wasn't just a tragedy whispered behind closed doors. It was the story. Front-page headlines, breaking news updates, radio stations buzzing with details of the courtroom battle. The town had never seen anything like it. Each morning, people gathered outside the courthouse. Inside, every seat was filled. Mothers clutching their daughters' hands a little tighter, fathers staring at Rodel Castillo with unfiltered rage. Because this wasn't just about Angela anymore. It was about every woman who had ever walked home alone, feeling a shadow behind her. It was about every family who had feared the worst. It was about a community that had been shaken, a town that refused to let this horror fade into just another statistic. And their message was clear. They weren't going to let this go. Rodel Castillo had spent months in a prison cell, waiting for the inevitable. But when the trial began, he played one last card. Insanity. His defense team argued that he wasn't in his right mind, that his drug use, his upbringing, his circumstances had led him to that moment, that he wasn't responsible for what he had done, that he wasn't evil, just sick. They painted him as a broken man, shaped by a cruel world. But the prosecution? They had the truth. Psychological evaluations proved what the detectives had always known. Rodel had stalked Angela, chosen his moment, tact, overpowered, and he had kept a trophy. That wasn't a man out of control. That was a predator. And the judge saw right through him. Then came Edgar Castillo, the man who hadn't killed Angela, but had stood by, watched, helped his cousin escape. He had confessed, cooperated, but cooperation didn't make him innocent. And for that, the law had a price. Obstruction of justice. Accessory after the fact. His sentence was reduced. A slap on the wrist compared to what Angela's family had wanted. But Edgar would never be truly free. Because even if the law had been lenient, the people of Batangas wouldn't be. He would never be able to walk down a street without whispers following him. He would never be able to sit in a cafe without feeling the weight of a dozen stares. Because everyone knew who he was. And some crimes don't come with redemption. Rodel Castillo stood in the courtroom, hands cuffed, shoulders squared. But he wasn't smirking anymore. He had sat through testimony after testimony, watched Angela's mother sob on the witness stand, listened to the forensic evidence pile up against him. Now it was time. The courtroom fell into complete silence. Not a cough, not a shuffle, just the sound of the judge's voice, ringing through the air like a final sentence. Rodel Castillo, you are sentenced to life in prison, without the possibility of parole. A collective exhale. A release of breath that had been held for far too long. Angela's family wept. Not with relief, not with joy, but with the bittersweet knowledge that while justice had been served, it would never bring her back. Outside, the streets of Batangas filled with murmurs. Some called it closure. Others called it too little, too late. But one thing was certain. Angela Martinez had been silenced. But her story would never be forgotten. The lasting impact cases like these, they never truly close. Not for the families, not for the community, and not for the detectives who live with the ghosts of the victims they couldn't save. Angela Martinez's case was over. Her murderer was behind bars. Her family had heard the verdict. The headlines had moved on. But justice doesn't bring someone back. And the scars left behind? They don't fade just because a judge slams a gavel. The family's grief. Angela's parents still set a place for her at the dinner table. Her room? Untouched. A shrine to the life she never got to finish. Her mother still wakes up in the middle of the night, expecting to hear the sound of her daughter's footsteps in the hallway. Her father still catches himself checking his phone, half expecting a message. But the messages never come, because Angela is gone, and no amount of justice can change that. A town that will never forget Batangas changed after Angela's murder. Women stopped walking home alone. Doors that used to stay open were now locked before sunset. The once quiet town became a place of whispered fears. People had always known monsters existed. They just never thought one would come from their own streets. But the hardest part? The questions no one could answer. Had Rodel done this before? Had Edgar watched and stayed silent more than once? And the most chilling thought of all, how many more victims were out there? Women who had fought. Women who had screamed. Women whose names were never spoken, whose cases were never solved. Angela was one of the lucky ones, because at least someone listened. At least someone fought for her. At least she had a voice, even if it came too late. But what about the others? A final question. The case was closed. The files were locked away. But the story wasn't over. Because out there, somewhere in the darkness, another woman is walking home. And someone is watching. So the question isn't if there will be another Angela Martinez. The question is, will anyone be there to stop it?